How's everybody doing? We're going to get started here. Thanks for joining us this morning. We'll just introduce who we are. We are the Super Marcato brothers. My name is Carl Bergman. This is Will Bergman and Marty Bergman. We host a video game music podcast called the Super Marcato Brothers. We're also composers as well. And today we're going to talk about the history of video game music. So we're going to start at really the origins of it. And we should mention that today is going to be pretty much just talking about the consoles. Now there's a lot to talk about. You could have a whole panel about arcade music. You could have a whole panel about computer game music. But in order to fit a lot of information in an hour, we're just going to be talking about the consoles, starting with the Atari 2600, moving all the way to the PS4, Xbox One. So our conversation today pretty much starts with the 2600. Now, before we start talking about the Atari, it is worth mentioning that, you know, the infancy of video games, sound always had a pretty important role.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think about some of the earliest attempts at home video game machines, we think of some of the Pong consoles in the 1970s,
Right.
Really where instead of, we think of the modern console like the Atari as really being the pioneer where you had interchangeable cartridges to play different games, but some of these old Pong machines, you would get the machine and you would hook up the wires to your TV. And you could only play one game, and it was Pong. And the audio actually for those games came out of internal speakers in the machine itself, so it wasn't coming from the TV. But that just goes to show that, you know, even from its infancy, there has always been sort of a role that sound has played in video games, albeit even if it wasn't specifically musical in nature.
And I think the importance and the significance of not just sound, but obviously music, really started to evolve after this era. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about the Atari 2600. So up there you'll see some info on the sound. So it had a pretty basic 2-channel pulse or noise chip. And basically that's just a synth chip that could generate musical tones, notes, as well as noise. And back in the 80s, the noise channel for these various systems was usually used for drums or sound effects, more of a percussive sound.
It's sort of the white noise that we think of on like an old TV when it's not getting a good signal. That's sort of that's one of the parameters that you can control.
So it did have that capability, and later on in the Atari's life, you will start to hear composers being able to actually divide that into 3. It's still very primitive, but for the most part, you know, early Atari 2600 games, most of them had no music. If they did, there were very short jingles that was usually all handled by the designer of the game. Because the role of music was so limited, they didn't have the budget for a separate composer. So a lot of times, all those duties were handled by one person, and that's the case with what we're gonna play an example of Pitfall 2, The Lost Caverns. Now, this actually came out near the end of the Atari age, and the designer of the game is David Crane. He also did the music.
Very handsome.
And this is actually one of the more impressive examples of music on the 2600. Let's take a listen to the main theme from Pitfall 2. Pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah, that's a lovely little piece of music. I mean, obviously, to our modern ears, it probably sounds very primitive. But honestly, to me, the first time I heard this, having played the Atari as a kid,
And having played Pitfall 1, which
I was just so blown away that something like this was able to be produced on the Atari. And I mean, it's really interesting what David Crane was able to pull off with just, again, that very primitive sound. Just to talk about the music for a little bit of this piece, what I think is so fun is it's very evident. I mean, this is one of the earliest pieces of console video game music right here. But the influences of it are so interesting to me. I think clearly there's a lot of influence from something like Indiana Jones or, you know, a John Williams film score, just as far as the da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da,
Well,
trying
one
to sound
thing
like
you
a
hear here,
flourishing flute melody.
I think is pretty impressive, is the tempo actually changes. It actually
Right.
goes down and then goes back, which must have been really hard to do on the Atari.
Well, and even in this early example, you can already hear sort of the approximation of instruments. You can
Right.
hear one of the pulse channels really operating like a bass guitar or sort of
Sure.
a double bass.
Well, and that's something we're going to continue to look at as we progress through the next few consoles that we're going to talk about. Is how back when video game machines had sound chips, the idea of synthesizing or approximating real instruments becomes a very prevalent concept, because when you're dealing with synthesizers, a lot of these composers, what makes it different from pop music that utilize synthesizers or say jazz fusion is they typically weren't trying to exploit the synth sounds themselves. They were really trying to use them to approximate other instruments.
And also, it's worth noting they were forced to use that.
Right.
They had no other option. So really, a lot of our focus today really has to be on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was released in North America in 1985. It was released a little bit earlier in Japan as the Famicom. And this, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with maybe the history of video games in general. If you've watched any of the wonderful documentaries that have come out in recent years, this really was responsible for saving the video game industry. The crash of 1984. It was really kind of, some people thought the fad of the home console was really reaching its end until the NES came out.
Really was just getting started.
It was just getting started.
It's funny to look back at that now.
So here's a couple things to note for the sound of the NES. You have 5 total sound channels. Now as far as musical tones that you hear, you really only have 3. 2 of them pulse channels that you can have some control over.
So for those pulse channels, what Carl just mentioned, sometimes those are referred to as the square channels. And what we mean if you hear these words square, triangle, sine wave, it's really just talking about the actual waveform, the shape of the actual sound waveform that travels out into space. Since they're synthesized, this chip was able to approximate it. And that pulse channel, they call it a square wave, because if you look at the actual shape of the sine wave, it moves almost in these rectangular blocks, where the triangle wave moves in these jagged sort of triangle shapes. It's kind of complicated, but essentially what that means, that's just affecting what we call the timbre of the sound. If I'm listening to an instrument, let's say an oboe or a flute, the way that our ears can distinguish the difference between those instruments is the shape of the sound wave, and specifically what overtones it's emphasizing. So the great thing about synthesis is it's able to roughly approximate. People say that the triangle may sound like a flute, and the square waves could sound like some sort of brass instrument.
But also the square wave tone is so pure, it's more pure than any acoustic instrument.
Right.
It's perfect in a way.
And also
It's
with
very
the two pulse channels, you were able to actually control the volume of those channels, and there's some other sort of changes in timbre that you
So
control, but
finishing
up,
up, talking about those, you have the 2 pulse channels, you have 1 triangle channel. That was pretty much exclusively used for bass. And you had a lot less control over that channel. You couldn't control the volume. You couldn't really control the timbre of that. That's why it was used for bass, because in the lower registers, the timbre matters a little bit less.
Sure.
So that classic NES bass sound is the triangle channel. You have a noise channel, which again is that white noise that was used a lot of times for drums, for sound effects.
Oh, yeah, exactly. The other thing to mention is that pretty much all of these channels were additionally used as sound effects. So that's why if you play a game from the 80s on the NES, particularly a memory that always sticks with me is playing Super Mario Bros. 3, going up into the clouds, and you collect those coins, and there's constant, and it cuts out some of the channels of music that you're hearing. So maybe you'll only end up hearing the bass voice, but that was one of the things that a lot of these early sound programmers had to deal with, is they were using this limited amount of resources, not only to create incredible music, but also to have to create sound effects and to split between those duties and decide which voice was more important and which voice could be left out.
So the last thing that you have on a technical level that you really don't start to hear until later on in the NES's life is the very low quality sample channel, which was eventually used for drum sounds and bass sounds.
Yeah, it's called the DPCM channel, and it's actually, we think of the NES, we call it an 8-bit console, whatever that means. But the sample channel was actually only in 1 bit.
1 bit.
So it was very, very primitive. Not a lot of games used it. There were a couple instances of like recorded dialogue or little quotes just for novelty's sake to have in games. Sort of the precursor of Sega or something like that very primitive that you could do on the NES.
Well, let's play a musical example from right smack dab in maybe the peak of maybe creativity, or when you think about how prolific that era was. This is from Castlevania, and we're going to play Wicked Child, composed by Kinuyo Yamashita. So really you're starting to hear the not so subtle influence of pop music of the 80s on these composers. Now it is worth noting that, the NES, some of these early systems, Japanese composers were obviously dominating, because when we think about these Konami games, these Nintendo games, these were being made in Japan, these Capcom games. So it is worth mentioning some of the Japanese influences of the time musically. Japanese film music was a big one. Jazz fusion was a big one. Groups like Yellow Magic Orchestra, which was a Japanese jazz fusion group of the time, late 70s, definitely played a role in influencing these composers. But in general, just pop music, universal.
And
pop
I think
music.
another thing from a historical standpoint to recognize is a lot of the Western and American companies that were making games for the Atari or for arcade machines at the time were going out of business because of the video game crash of 1984. So not only did Nintendo and the Nintendo Entertainment System revitalize the industry, but it was also doing better in Japan, which gave a lot of these Japanese companies like Konami or Capcom sort of the advantage to a lot of the Western developers. And I think that's one of the reasons why when we think of video game music as a genre or a style, particularly in this early era when really you can listen to a lot of video game soundtracks and they have
a sound,
similar qualities.
A musical style, not just talking about the chips. We can get a little too caught up on the technicals, but it's important to talk about music too.
Yeah, and actually, if we kind of dive into the piece that we just listened to, it really is almost a textbook example of kind of the heyday of Nintendo Entertainment System music. You're hearing that bass-sounding instrument, the triangle, the boop, 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 boop. And the noise channel is starting to get a little more active and sort of a drum beat. And then we kind of hear the remaining two pulse channels are usually performing some kind of harmonized melody. And for those of us that kind of grew up in this era or have a lot of exposure to these games, all of those particular details sort of describe the aesthetic and the style of a lot of Nintendo music. We can see that really it's kind of hard to separate what component of that is really just working with the technological limitations that they had or solving technological problems that they had, and what component of that was their musical influence. And they really come together in this really special way. So much so that this music really kind of continues to be timeless for a while.
Well, I think one thing that we'll probably talk about as we go on today is I think one of the consistent things about video game music, when you look about back in 1986 right here to 2015, is I think for the most part, the talented composers were matching the experience of the game really well. And that's what you hear nowadays, when you play Black Ops 3. They're really matching the tone of the game with the music, but that tone has changed over the years. So that's one thing to talk about, is that the tone of the games have changed.
I think the other thing we need to mention is that these incredible limitations we've described don't just exist from a technological standpoint. They become incredibly prevalent when we think about the compositional approach to this. When functionally you are able only to have 3 pitches at once, that's incredibly limiting. But it's also a wonderful challenge, and I think one of the reasons we get so much incredible melodic, tuneful writing in the NES is because of that limitation. Because since they only had 3 voices, every note mattered. Everything that the triangle was doing needed to be absolutely necessary for the bass, and every melodic note needed to be as incredibly catchy. And I think one of the great things about NES music or early era video game music is the combination of those limitation of sounds with the kind of fullness of texture that we're able to get because it's so rhythmic, because it's so syncopated. It's really like nothing we had ever heard before.
Well, speaking of rhythmic, we're going to play one final example, and then we'll finally move on, because the NES is just so important in the history of video game music. We're going to play an example of a game called Journey to Sillius. Has anybody heard of this game? Journey to Sillius? We have one person. So this pretty late NES game, and this is very important to talk about this game in the history of video game music because it utilizes that DPCM sample channel for the bass.
So it's actually pitched. So
sampled bass.
What they would do is they would sample different pitches of a bass guitar and incorporate them into the music. So it's incredibly kind of a brilliant use of that technology.
So I don't know if anyone has ever played with sort of like an old Casio keyboard that would allow you to record a little audio sample, and then that gets spread out across every key, and the keyboard's just like hello, 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 hello. Or I think in Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Yeah. So that's
like
pretty
that,
much what you're hearing here.
That's they would incorporate a handful of bass guitar samples, and then they were sort of spread across their keyboard, you could say. So sometimes the pitch gets a little weird and a little strange.
And what's cool is this,
really unique sound.
it actually sounds more advanced than, when you're listening to it, it almost doesn't even sound like NES. So let's take a listen to Stage 3 from Journey to Sillius, composed by Naoki Kadaka. Pretty impressive stuff, especially coming from, starting off with that Pitfall 2 track and seeing even already in this short amount of years how much we've advanced technically and really musically too. This is starting to get into that era of video game music where it has its own sound. This is video game, it has that sound to it. It doesn't sound like really any other genre.
Well, it is almost its own genre, and I do attribute a lot of that to the Japanese composers that were working at the time, incorporating things from pop music, jazz fusion, film music, classical music, a lot of times rock music, into this one hybrid. And I think the glue that stitches everything together, honestly, are these primitive 8-bit sounds. That's the thing that, above all else, binds all video game music of this era. It's sort of this freedom to allow you to express yourself in any genre you want, and it ends up becoming this sort of unified sound.
It really does. And, classical music, you mentioned that. Last year at the first Game Rhapsody, we had a panel just about the classical influence of video game music. And there's a lot to be said for that. One of the things Marty mentioned is because they have these limitations with only a few voices, classical music is one great genre to use because if you can only have a few voices, when you think about counterpoint,
particularly Baroque era music where you could have a very complicated and beautiful piece by Bach, let's say, that is only ever using 2 pitches at once. So we talk about this being a limitation, but we don't necessarily think of the Bach inventions as being limited necessarily.
So I think it probably makes sense to finally move on from the NES. There's really a lot. We could have a whole panel on the NES, but we'll move on to the 16-bit era. So the Genesis came out in 1989. It was known as the Mega Drive in Japan and Europe as well. That's the first console. There was a different version that came out that we actually had growing up. This is the first model of the Genesis. And it really was pretty exciting, especially when you're talking about the sound department. So now on the Genesis, you have 10 total sound channels. It's doubling what you had on the NES. 6 tone channels of FM. So you could have 6 notes at once of FM synth, and FM stands for frequency modulation. It's a type of a synthesized sound that was developed in the 80s by Yamaha. There's a really popular keyboard called the DX7, which was integrated into a lot of pop music. Arcade machines in the late 80s did start to integrate FM synth, and it's a very crisp and biting and just hard-hitting sound.
It was a different type of synthesis, like when we talked about those square waves and triangle waves. The FM synth has a more percussive attack. A lot of times in this Genesis music, we're going to hear it try to approximate the sound of a distorted guitar. It has that almost string.
It can have these sort of swells, or sort of like
you have a lot more control. So in addition to those 6 channels, you also had 4 channels of PSG, which, without getting too technical, is very similar to the NES kind of 8-bit sounds. Much simpler tones there. The last one of those 4 could be a noise channel, so you have the noise channel as well. And the last of the FM channels could be equipped to play samples. So, for example, Sonic the Hedgehog, that classic kick drum and snare drum sample, that's utilizing that DAC sample
Or the
channel.
Sega beginning
Yep.
of the game.
And that took up
Almost the whole cartridge.
Almost the whole cartridge, just for the Sega. So we're going to play an example here. This is a little bit later on in the Genesis's lifespan. This is from Sonic 3. We're going to play Angel Island Zone. Let's take a listen. So this track was composed by Kaminori Sawada and Yoshiaki Kashima, and you're already starting to hear just how, one of the reasons we wanted to play a track a little bit later in the Genesis lifespan is these composers were so comfortable with this technology at this point, and it's just so much more lush and colorful than what you heard in previous generations. The combination of the FM synth with the PSG channels, it's such a colorful sound, this combination of sharp and soft textures. And every game had so much diversity, and every soundtrack sounded so different. There was ones that were very PSG heavy, there were ones that didn't use the PSG channel at all, and it is worth noting that when you think about that FM chip, really, if I were to be using that chip, some of the genres I would probably use would probably be rock, funk, R&B, jazz. Those are genres that are so rhythmically oriented, and that's what the Genesis does the best at.
I agree. I think the other thing with the addition of the extra pitch channels, it allows you to have fuller sounding harmonies. I mean, we talked about how a lot of these composers had a jazz music influence, and when we think of a lot of jazz chords, you're getting a lot of 4-note, 5-note, 6-note chords, and they're finally able to do stuff like that on the Genesis, have these full chords. In addition, you're able to have these counter melodic lines. In this piece you heard all these additional colors that are separate from melody, bass, and harmony.
Absolutely. So that's obviously a very exciting turning point in video game music, but arguably more exciting was this little system.
Well, and I think the important thing to mention, this is the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, so this is the successor to the NES. The thing to mention is that the SNES and the Sega Genesis were really contemporaries. So even though the SNES came out after the Genesis, it's best to think of those two as peers and rivals. And a lot of their soundtracks there were games that were released for both the SNES and the Genesis, and so they both kind of had to be able to sort of do the same thing. But when we look at the internals of the Super Nintendo, it has a completely different way that it produces its sound.
And really different strengths and weaknesses in the Genesis. And it really was fitting when you think of the console wars, the butting heads of the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Musically, they were almost opposite. So basically on the Super Nintendo, you have only sample channels. You actually have 8 sample channels, very different types of sample channels than you would have on the NES or the Genesis. So that's really all the music you hear on the Super Nintendo consists of these little itty-bitty samples. If it's a steel drum, for example, it's going to be one little sample that was loaded in, and then they're pitching it up and down.
So you no longer are like the Genesis to me is the full realization of synthesizers. It's completely constructing the waveforms, but it's able to do a lot of complex things with it and get all these interesting timbres. The Super Nintendo, like Carl mentioned, it's like when we talked about that DPCM channel on the NES. It's the realization of that technology of taking these short, sampled, sometimes acoustic instruments, sometimes just general MIDI instruments, but actually pitching things up and down.
Which sort of means that for the first time, really, in console video games, we're starting to hear sounds that approximate pretty closely, in some cases, real-world instruments.
Just like we just heard.
Right, we're starting to hear sort of real violins. There's some wonderful Squaresoft RPGs that start to use very realistic-sounding piano samples, which is not something that the Genesis was able to do because it was strictly a synthesizer-based chip.
And you also had very primitive reverb technology. So in addition to just these musical effects, you could also sort of create the sound, and that's why we get with so much Super Nintendo music the sound of a full orchestra.
Because it was possible for the first time. When you think about the year 1991, you had the release in North America, you had Mario World, you had The Legend of Zelda in Link to the Past in Japan. ActRaiser was a big one, Final Fantasy IV, and then eventually Chrono Trigger. You started to have this reputation of the SNES could do symphonic music.
Right.
Because it really could. That was really one of the strengths of that system. One of the things that it probably didn't do quite as well was funkier, more kind of groovy, rhythmic stuff.
Well, and you get the compliments and challenges of the system. One of the great things is that each soundtrack has the potential of having a completely unique sound and using only its instruments. But then also you have the possibility of that being negative. Sometimes there were tuning issues with these samples.
Yeah, so the example we're going to play from this system is from a very small game that probably no one's in this room has heard of before. This is Super Mario World.
I think it's Mario.
I think it's Mario. And this track was composed by Koji Kondo, really the godfather of game music. This is the overworld from Mario World. It couldn't be more iconic. It couldn't be more famous. Probably the most famous example that we're playing today. We didn't play the original Mario Brothers theme. We could have, obviously, but we have to play this if we didn't play that theme.
Well, and I think this captures one of the other really interesting sounds and aesthetics of video game music, which is a really eclectic combination of instruments. The melody here is on a steel drum. We're starting to hear some interesting, almost electric guitar samples, and flutes and clarinets and
electric
mandolins.
bass.
If we were to hear that in a real life context,
It'd be
and
weird.
honestly, it might be so eclectic that we wouldn't be able to focus. But
Well, that's really owed to Koji Kondo
Right.
for being the one to come up with that idea. And when we think about this 16-bit era, it's so eclectic. Most soundtracks that have this kind of colorful, child-friendly tone have instrument sets like this. And Koji Kondo, this is one of the first times this was done.
Well, I think what this goes to show is a lot of these composers worked in the 8-bit era, and they were trying to say, how can we take that same musical language and reimagine it with all these new instruments? What kind of real-world instruments would approximate the kinds of sounds we've been making? And so, to me, this further solidifies the idea that video game music was sort of its own genre, because when they attempted to approximate it with real-world instruments, there wasn't really a specific thing that they could do.
Well, I think something worth noting about this soundtrack, and we're going to talk about this as time goes on, is one of the early examples of interactivity in the music. When you hop on Yoshi, who knows what happens? Anybody know what happens when you hop on Yoshi? Bongos are added. A very simple but effective way to make the music interactive, so it feels like you're in control. And that's something that we start to see a lot more in the N64 era, and nowadays that's really the name of the game.
Well, and the other important thing to mention, the Super Nintendo was the last era, really, where our sound effects and music was being produced in the same way. On the NES, of course, you only had those synthesizers, so all the sound effects kind of had to be musical in nature.
Right.
But on the Super Nintendo, composers like Koji Kondo made a specific choice to make the sound effects musical. When Mario jumps, it's the sound of a pan flute sort of sliding up, and he made the choice to keep the sound effects and music in the same, sound language, so to speak.
Well, there's actually a quick shout out. We didn't talk about it, but in the NES, the original Mario Brothers, if you actually slow down the sound effects, it's actually pretty musical.
yeah, one of the most exciting Easter eggs in the original Super Mario Brothers soundtrack is if you slow down the mushroom sound when Mario gets a mushroom and he grows. It really bears a lot of resemblance to what happens when you clear a stage and when you
The flagpole.
you could almost consider it like a slow motion version of that. So it's really interesting to see how these sound designers who came from a musical background kind of incorporated your musical instincts in creating these memorable sounds.
So another thing worth noting, if anyone is wondering, we don't have time to talk about every console. So we're not going to be talking about, for example, the TurboGrafx 16.
Or the Atari Jaguar.
So that's a shout out definitely to give. We just don't have time. There is some things we could say about it. One thing TG16 related is I always equate that to almost like a 10-bit sound. It sounded like right in the middle of the NES and the Super Nintendo. It's kind of right in the middle there.
It was the first 16-bit console.
It is worth talking about this next system, though. We're now going to move on to the Sega Saturn. So the Sega Saturn was a pretty tragic system. It was kind of in the time when it was really the start of the decline for Sega as far as hardware goes. It was a failure commercially. It did not sell very well. You think about a year after this was released in 1994. A year after this was released, the PlayStation came out and pretty much changed the face of video game music. There was also a lot of struggle and conflict between Sega of Japan and Sega of North America, which was part of the problem. Not having a big Sonic title was a huge kind of nail in the coffin of the Sega Saturn. But that being said, we'll talk a little bit about the exciting sound capability. It did have a built-in FM synth chip similar to the Genesis, but it had full CD audio, one of the first systems to have full CD audio. So that pretty much meant that composers now, all those limitations of the past, pretty much out the window.
As far as composing, you know, if you wanted to write a piece of music, if you could put it on a CD, you could have it in the game. You didn't have the same type of interaction that we have with that music, say, in our current generation. But as far as the sound quality, it was just an incredible leap forward.
Play a little bit of this track here, give you guys an idea. So this is from Guardian Heroes, which came out for the Saturn. This track is called Rough and Lady, and it's a pretty decent example of kind of combining old and new. It still feels like video game music. It's kind of cheesy and fun, but it utilizes real, it's a real recording here. What you heard a lot in this era were composers that were a little trigger happy. They were so excited to move away from these hard limitations that they kind of ended up making music that ironically doesn't hold up as much as NES.
Well, I think it reflects a lot of the production cliches of the era. If you listen to pop music from the 80s and 90s, a lot of times you have that, ooh, there's too much reverb, or this instrument choice or this production choice doesn't really hold up as well. And the great thing about video game music, it never sounded contemporary. There was never a period of old school video game music where it really sounded modern. So in a way, it holds up better than stuff like this.
You mean the
really
Soprano
sounds
sax?
there. Yeah.
You don't think this sounds modern? Yeah.
Well, also the game composers now really had to go toe-to-toe with top engineers, producers, composers of just all of our music out in the pop space, the rock space, and honestly, a lot of them didn't necessarily have that same level of production experience. So when we go back to some of these soundtracks, some of the arrangement choices, the production, the mixing is not really at a level where it's aged all that well.
Well, before we move on to the Sony PlayStation, I think it's important to mention that Sega did release one more console eventually, the Sega Dreamcast, which we're not necessarily going to be taking a focus on. It was a really good system, but ultimately it wasn't successful enough, and Sega lost the console wars, and they had to cancel their hardware initiatives. And this next console is one of the reasons why.
So the Sony PlayStation, it's almost hard now for those of us really entrenched in gaming to remember a time before Sony was a major player in the consoles.
But there was a time.
What's interesting though is the release of the PlayStation is almost in lockstep with a major failure on Nintendo's part. Sony had designed the sound chip that we talked about on the Super Nintendo, and they were working together to try to create actually additionally an add-on, a CD-based add-on.
And what was that add-on going to be called?
It's going to be called the PlayStation. And there's it's a fun sort of Googling rabbit hole. You can see a few images online
The
of
Nintendo
this prototype.
And
The
Nintendo
PlayStation.
turned them down.
And it had the Super Nintendo controller, which, the D-pad on the left, the 4 buttons, the shoulder buttons. And basically what happened is in a tech conference, Nintendo basically publicly shamed Sony. They announced that, we're going to be partnering with Philips. And the Sony executives were in the audience. They had no idea this was happening. So they really burned this bridge, and Sony felt compelled to go into the space themselves.
With that, let's play an example from the PlayStation 1. We're going to play a track from Castlevania Symphony of the Night, one of the most popular and beloved games and soundtracks on the system. This is Dracula's Castle by Michiru Yamane. pretty good example. The reason why we picked this one is because we played a previous Castlevania track, and it's fun to see in one series how it evolves. You know, this feels like a combination. It feels like she's utilizing those classical influences of the past, but also taking advantage of the technology.
Well, I think that's what's interesting. If you guys don't remember, the second piece that we played, one of the first NES examples that we talked about, was from the original Castlevania. And so one of the fun things about the history of video game music is still, when we think about it, they're a relatively new medium. So, you know, you could have a game series where maybe they'd only have 3 entries, and the distance between the first game and the most recent one would be like 10 years apart. But the difference between the music is such a chasm. I mean, what I think is interesting, like Carl mentioned, this composer, Michiru Yamane, she was looking at some of the similar influences of classical music and everything. But the style, aesthetically, of the original Castlevania, it was more tongue-in-cheek, it was more fun. Where a game on the PlayStation is going to tend to have more text and be darker and take itself more seriously, and the music needs to reflect
Well,
that.
there's one quick shout out I want to make that we forgot to touch on, and some of you may notice. One of my favorite things about video game music, and I think one of the reasons why it's fairly progressive when you're talking about music history, is there was a time when it was almost dominated by female composers.
Right.
And that is not something when you think about the history of Western classical music. That was not the
Film
case.
music.
It's really not the case in any other types of music. Really, as far as when you think back to, you know, Baroque, classical, this was a time when these Japanese female composers were dominating. And I think that's a pretty awesome thing to mention. It's a
Yeah, I mean, I
wonderful
think
thing.
some of the most famous franchises in video games, Mega Man, Street Fighter 2, these have some of the most
Castlevania.
timeless, Castlevania, some of the most timeless music by these behemoth female composers.
Almost all Japanese.
Yeah, you know, unfortunately, we don't really tend to see many female composers from the West, either from America or from Europe. Just like how we tend not to see very many female composers in Western film music.
So it's interesting. There's not really, I don't really know what it would be, but to kind of think about what was happening in Japan that made them so
What can we learn
progressive.
from, really?
So with that being said, I think it probably makes sense to move on to this next system here. Let's play just a few seconds of a track from this system that some of you might recognize. So basically,
This is the Nintendo 64.
this is the Nintendo 64, if anyone doesn't know. This came out a year after the PlayStation. This was released in '96. And if you're just talking in the audio department, a lot of people thought it was a pretty big step down from the PlayStation. Before we get too much into the technical side, it is worth noting that the release of Mario 64, which was a launch game, 64, revolutionized the industry, really kind of made 3D platformer a successful thing.
Well, and it was another iteration of Koji Kondo's brilliant work on the Super Mario Brothers
What you're hearing
series.
here is from Star Fox 64, if anyone doesn't know. But let's talk a little bit about the audio of the Nintendo 64. It's a wonderful system. It did pretty well. It didn't sell nearly as much as the PlayStation, but it did pretty well commercially. There's no dedicated sound chip on the N64. So even if you're just talking about that, it's almost a downgrade from the Super Nintendo, because the Super Nintendo had a dedicated sound chip. The audio and the graphics were all handled by the same CPU. So that meant the more power you put into the graphics, the more focus of the graphics, the less room you had for the sound. And if you had too many samples, too much going on sound-wise, the graphics would suffer. And you can probably guess what took priority in the production. The graphics took priority. So there were a lot of soundtracks where the quality of the music suffered. But I will say because of that, I think, again, facing these pretty hard limitations of size, composers really wrote some of the same kinds of music that you heard in the past. One of the reasons why the sound of the Nintendo 64 is so different from the PlayStation, because the composers really had no choice. They were writing music that was kind of similar to the NES.
Well, and I think
SNES.
Nintendo has an interesting legacy of imposing limitations on themselves, and sometimes it can be, you know, frustrating for us as consumers. But era after era, these challenges that the composers have to face and these problems that they have to end up solving lead to some of the most memorable music in the whole tradition of video games.
So really, the N64 for me represented a double-edged sword. Yeah, technically it sounds a little crappy. Again, it's these samples that we heard from the SNES, not really much improved. If you're, something from Castlevania Unite, with like real guitars, and it's like modern and rocking. Going from Star Fox 64, it seems like a step down. But musically,
well, yeah, musically,
wonderful.
I think the great thing about the N64, we're still getting those incredible tunes. I think a lot of people that grew up in that era, the music that they're going to be humming and singing in the shower and remembering to this day are going to be from games like Mario 64,
Ocarina of Time,
Banjo-Kazooie, and
really,
like
in some ways, musically, much more of a legacy than the PS1. We talk about these soundtracks way more nowadays, and that's doubly impressive because it was way harder to work on the music.
And in a way, because it's so overtly synthesized and sort of artificial, it has aged a lot better in some cases than some of the CD quality audio on the PlayStation 1.
That's a good point, Marty, because we know that it's fake. It's not fooling
So
anybody.
our brains immediately do whatever kind of calculation it takes to kind of understand the context.
Like once we get,
and we embrace it.
Once we get used to it, we completely accept it. We're in that world. Whereas the PlayStation, one of the struggles is because it was bordering unrealistic. There's something called the uncanny valley effect, where when you get close enough to being real, but you're not real, it can actually be more of a
sort of
hard thing
disturbing
to
sometimes.
understand. Well, quick thing, obviously we talked about the Dreamcast. Boo-hoo, very sad. A year later, this little system came out, which, just to give you guys a quick context of, the NES sold 61 million units, which was incredibly successful. PS1 sold 155 million units, and it wasn't discontinued until 13 years after.
Or the PS2.
PS2 wasn't discontinued until 13 years after it was released. 2013. The PS2 was finally discontinued. So an incredibly successful console. If you talk about, how much it sold, the impact of it, how it really changed video game music. We're going to play an example from Silent Hill 2. This is the theme of Laura, composed by Akira Yamaoka. So the PS2, as we mentioned, was really the best-selling console of all time at this point. And again, there's really not. You notice we didn't have anything on the audio specs. Really, we don't really need to talk about that as much. Now we're getting to the point where this kind of sounds like where we are nowadays. It's really not that much different. The advancements in interactivity have changed, and the graphics of the games have changed, and the stakes have really are continuing to rise. But this feels like modern video game music. Will, when you think about a track like this, how does this differentiate itself from what we heard on the NES?
Well, I think the great thing about a track like this is that it's still very melodic. It still is melody focused. And you can't say that about all modern video game music, which is a potential downside. But I think the main difference is, I think the emotional stakes are much higher. Something like this is taking itself much more seriously, and it's appealing to different emotions than we really appeal to on the NES. The other thing, we're getting the sound of real instruments. These are actually, all the things we're hearing are still samples. So that's a piano sample and a violin sample. But they sound so good, they might as well be the real thing at this point.
And it is worth mentioning that some of you, anybody a Silent Hill fan here in the room? You may be familiar that most of the music you hear in the series is very creepy and dissonant and ominous.
Right.
It's something that really wouldn't have been possible in previous generations, mainly because the tone of this game dictated that.
So yeah,
and we didn't really touch on as Carl said, the technical audio specs, because really, just like the PlayStation 1, we're now essentially, for the most part, every game just playing audio files from a disc.
Yeah.
So the composer's focus is more on producing those mixed, finished products.
Yeah, well, in some ways you could say that it's similar because we talk so much about samples, these little individual samples that are being manipulated. It's still really the case with the PS2. It's samples, but the whole track is a sample now. And let's say you have a game in this era, or really, nowadays, let's say you're playing Black Ops 3, right? And all of a sudden you enter a cave, maybe an additional cello will be added. That's really just playing another sample and fading up another sample. It's really just about samples coming in and out, but now the samples are so much more full. So with that, we should probably move on. We'll spend just a little bit of time talking about the Xbox. There's really not as much needed to be said, exclusively about the Xbox. It came around the same time as the PS2. The reason to buy it was this game, Halo Combat Evolved, and we're going to play an example from this game. And it represents a different facet of this generation of video game music. This is Rock Anthem for Saving the World.
So composers Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore, Halo was really, you could think of it as almost like a rebirth of video games. It really changed the whole course and direction of gaming. And I think these composers did a wonderful job of kind of reimagining the sound of what a video game should sound like. What's great about Halo is, much like when we talk about early video game music, it's borrowing inspiration from a myriad of different places. The Halo music combines things from classical music and Gregorian chant, but also rock music and orchestral music. And it's really this wonderful hybrid that's, again, something we only see in video games.
Absolutely. And it's also worth mentioning that kind of goes along with the next system we're going to be talking about. In
Isn't it
really
odd?
It's adorable, but it's such a stark contrast to the other two systems. In this time,
So Halo was not available?
it was not available. It couldn't fit on the mini disc. So this era to me, and this was the first era where I was actually currently involved. I bought a GameCube. I think I was in 8th grade, and it was the first time I was current. There really seemed to be not 3 camps, 2 camps of music. The PS2 and Xbox, the games that were being designed for hardcore gamers, and the tones of those games dictated the type of music. And then all of a sudden Nintendo over here, still doing the same thing they've done in the past. You listen to a soundtrack on the GameCube, it has these general MIDI sounds. It sounds like the N64.
Yeah.
It's really not much more advanced.
But again, it's with Nintendo music, it's not about the sounds, it's about the melodies, it's about the music. And that's why something like Legend of Zelda Wind Waker it's one of the greatest video game soundtracks ever produced, and it's not about the sounds.
So let's take an example. This is Dragon Roost Island from Wind Waker. Such a strong melody.
Nintendo has this way to make their limitations and to make sort of the artificiality of it incredibly charming. From the design of the consoles on down, they really embrace this fun-loving, charming.
Well, it's also, this is a great example because this game, the tone of the game, this really kind of rousing, swashbuckling adventure. The game has that in and of itself, but musically, Kenta Nagata was the lead composer in this game. He actually also worked on games like Mario Kart 64. He's done a lot of great work. But this was really the first time where that was possible. Imagine, you could have a swashbuckling soundtrack on the Super Nintendo. I think of Donkey Kong Country is an example of that. But this is really the first time where you're able to utilize different world music instruments and traditions into something like Zelda, so it feels like a new generation.
Well, the other thing great about Nintendo, and a lot of franchises in video games, is that they're very precious about their lineage, both as far as the game and really the musical language. Something like Zelda, at this point, there's been so many different composers who've worked on this series, and I think they all treat it with this incredible sense of honor, because a lot of these composers, they have different backgrounds, different ages, different generations, but they all try to capture the same harmonic language and the same sort of spirit, and I think that's the thing that I really enjoy.
Yeah, and that also leads us into the next system we're going to be talking about. So really, the next generation is the Wii, PS3, Xbox 360. Now the Wii was a massively successful console commercially. It sold 101 million units. Part of the reason for that is the family-friendly nature of some of the games that were released. But musically, it was a really exciting time, mainly for me, for the Mario Galaxy series. we're going to play a track from Mario Galaxy 2, and this was actually one of the tracks that was composed by veteran composer Koji Kondo.
So we think about this man who is essentially considered the godfather of video game music. I mean, Super Mario Brothers was one of the first games that really people paid attention to the music, and that he's still working today.
And let's take a listen to how the Mario series has changed. Such a wonderful piece of music. It really feels like a combination of old and new, utilizing a full orchestra. And Mario Galaxy was the first time in the Mario series that was done. Really one of the first time in a main Nintendo game that was done. Star Fox Assault had it.
Those stole my name.
Kind of weird that had it so early, but really exciting. It's just, it feels like this amazing adventure. When you're in space, I can't think of not having an orchestra. When you're in space, the connotations from something like Star Wars, 2001: Space Odyssey. It's such a great combination. It still feels like it fits in the Mario series.
Well, that's the great thing. It's still maintaining the focus on melody, the focus on tunefulness, playfulness, fun. That's what the Mario series has always been about. And whether that's on 3-pitch voices on the NES or whether it's with a full orchestra in Mario Galaxy 2, that emphasis and that attention to detail for melodic craft.
One of the exciting things for me is the Wii represented musically, finally Nintendo actually being current with the technology and the trends that you're seeing. The GameCube, they were still doing their own thing, fighting these hard limitations that they really didn't have to have with the mini disc. But now you're finally seeing soundtracks that sound every bit as good as the competition. So we'll quickly talk about PS3 and Xbox 360. One example we're going to play is from BioShock, which was released for both systems by the wonderful Gary Scheinman. Let's play a little bit of Welcome to Rapture here.
Something so cool about this is, at this point, we're sort of in our contemporary era of video game music. Gary Scheinman, this music for BioShock, it's every bit as sophisticated as any music you would hear for a film. And a fun note, Gary Scheinman actually teaches film scoring at the University of Southern California. So that goes to show, if you have film composers working on video games, we really are completely caught up to the status of films and film music.
So I think this era represents a positive and a negative. The positive is you're having music that is so sophisticated, not any less sophisticated than film music. And you know, and you have video games in general having a lot more respect culturally and being considered as art. The downside of this era is because of that, because of these film composers that are working on these games, you're starting to lose the identity of video game music.
And sort of the lineage. I mean, a lot of composers in this era did come from film and television, and they don't carry with them the lineage that. The reason we played that Nintendo example is because that's really looking at the evolution of how one composer can change and adapt to the progress of technology. But now, once we get to this era, we have people that weren't involved in video games in the 80s and 90s and are now starting to
it's just another example of the difference between, in a lot of ways, what Nintendo's doing and what the other guys are doing. Because now we can play an example from this system. It couldn't be more different.
You've probably never heard of this. This is called the Nintendo Wii U. And
we're actually not joking.
Yeah. A lot of people didn't even know about this when this came out because Nintendo didn't do a very good job of marketing for this console.
A lot of people thought it was an add-on to the Wii, but when you're hearing musically, this is from Mario 3D World, and it couldn't be more different from the music that you hear on the other systems. It really represents, what is unique about Nintendo, and they really stick to their guns. Good or bad, there's positives and negatives to it. Luckily, musically, it's wonderful. It's composed by Mahito Yokota, who worked on Mario Galaxy.
Well, and the thing is, this brings us to our current generation, which has, like Carl just mentioned, so many pros and so many cons. The positive things about it, obviously, is that there's practically limitless. I mean, whatever a composer is able to think up, we can really produce in our current video game soundtracks. The downfall is, like we mentioned before, you may lose some of that lineage. And also, one of the great things about old video game music, it's so tuneful. You know, some people think, why do we still go around humming tunes from Chrono Trigger and Ocarina of Time when those games are so old? And what about games, you know, in the last 10, 15 years? Why aren't we really remembering those themes as
It's
much?
interesting, you know, thinking about just the musical examples we played, and we had to leave so much out, obviously, but this, what you're hearing here, is actually from Black Ops 3. It just came out, so couldn't be more modern here. Listen to how far we've come from that Atari track that we started off with. It's crazy that
But
it's
also
all
like-
one medium.
Also, like you mentioned, Carl, I think you could play this and tell someone, oh, this is from a contemporary espionage movie, and you'd probably believe it. We are kind of losing what makes, at least an example like this, it's a wonderful piece of music, but it doesn't necessarily distinguish itself as video game music. Now, maybe that doesn't matter, maybe that does matter, but it's an interesting place to
Well,
find
the
ourselves.
last thing I want to talk about, and we're going to open it up for questions in a couple minutes here, is we have good and bad of you know, the era that we're in. I think the good thing is that we have so much variety. We have something like Fallout, we have something like Shovel Knight. And musically, it couldn't be more exciting because they're both great, but they're so different. Shovel Knight is a throwback, going, you know, a love letter to the NES era. But it's injected with this new, fresh music by Jake Kaufman.
Well, one of the cool things in the last, 5-10 years, there's been this resurgence of love for retro video games, both in far as the games themselves and soundtracks. And we get a lot of games, like Shovel Knight or Mega Man 9.
But the fact that you have those games as well as the Fallouts,
Right.
all happening, it's all one medium video games.
I mean, what I hope for is in the future that eventually those two things can sort of meet, and we can have a world where our
It's
video
not so
game music is
fragmented.
modern, it's contemporary, it's using all of our tools, but it's still within the lineage and paying love and tribute to all the games and soundtracks that have come before.
Well, and I think sort of the next plateau for the modern video game music is how can we really incorporate interactivity in a new way? And something Carl touched on briefly is in a lot of modern games, let's say you enter a new area or something different happens in the action and it triggers a new musical element. That's not something that happens in a film score because that's all sort of planned in advance and everything works according to that plan. There are some really exciting things that happen where we have these composers basically recording and producing 12 different tracks that all sort of work together, and those layers get introduced depending on what the player is choosing to do or what they end up encountering.
So really,
there's still a lot that can be explored.
yeah, implementationally, technically, there's a lot of exciting things. Musically, there doesn't seem to be as many steps. When we think about going from the Atari to the NES to the Genesis, there's all these really huge steps, and now our steps are getting a lot smaller.
Well, because it's almost like there isn't a window anymore. It's an open window. Before it was like there was sort of fuzzy glass, and then there was a screen, and if you squint, it kind of maybe sounds like an instrument that you know.
Sure.
Now we're hearing that pure sound. So it's about other challenges.
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful time to be, and I think we're all very optimistic and excited about the future of games and video game music. I know there's a lot of things that we didn't get to cover in this panel today.
Maybe next year we'll do.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's so much influence from the computer music scene, things like the Commodore 64, the whole arcade tradition. I mean, there's so much you can say about it, but we really wanted to take a focus at the history of video game consoles because that's what affected the majority of people, and that's the best way to sort of look at the evolution and the progression of games
Sure.
and video games in the home.
I think we're going to open it up for questions. We just wanted to give one little shout out. We actually do host a podcast called the Super Marcato Brothers. You can find us on iTunes. Every Monday we have an episode. Various, whether it's a series or a composer, all over the place, old school stuff and modern stuff. Our website is supermarcatobrothers.com. But with that said, we'll open it up so if anybody has any questions for us. Yes.
That last song you played from Black Ops 3, it sounded like it would fit in perfectly to a Metal Gear Solid game.
Right.
Absolutely, and that's
That's a great
that's a
observation.
great point. It would fit into a lot of games, really, and we're starting to hear a lot less uniqueness between soundtracks. It could fit into Metal Gear Solid.
Although you could argue that that happened in the Nintendo era.
Sure,
Exactly.
sure. Yeah, it's almost like we're
Music
getting
from
full circle.
Mega Man could maybe
Yeah.
exist in
Well,
Castlevania.
that's a
or-
great point. You go back to the NES and you play soundtracks like some baseball game, and it's like it's like Is this Mega Man or baseball? It doesn't really
You know,
matter.
Batman or Batman Return of the Joker on
Where
the NES
for-
sounds like Mega Man.
For my money, the 16-bit era was the peak of the uniqueness in that
Sure.
every soundtrack and every game was such a unique experience. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because now, you know, you hear that music, it's a little more par for the course. It's not as unique as stuff you kind of heard in the past. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for coming to this panel. We really enjoyed getting to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.